I installed a camera at home for security. What I saw my wife doing destroyed me. The notification lit up my phone at 2:47 in the morning, and I knew before opening it that something was wrong. I was lying in bed next to Tasha, her breathing slow and even, her back turned to me like it had been for months now, and my hand trembled as I unlocked the screen. The camera I'd installed 3 days earlier in our living room had detected movement, and the clip's timestamp showed it was earlier that night, before Tasha came upstairs. So while I was in bed now, the feed was showing me what I'd missed then, in this house we'd bought together 5 years ago when we still laughed at each other's jokes. Atlanta had been seeing a spike in break-ins all summer. Houses on our block hit twice in June, and I'd told Tasha back in March that we needed security, but she'd waved me off, said I was being paranoid, said it was money we didn't have to waste on fear. I'd let it go then. Told myself she was right, focused on keeping the lights on and the mortgage paid, but the anxiety never left. And when another house got hit 2 streets over, I went to Best Buy alone and bought 4 cameras without telling her. I told myself it was just about safety, just about protecting what we'd built. But the truth was I'd been feeling uneasy for months, a weight in my chest I couldn't name. Tasha had been different lately, distant in a way that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness, just absence, like she was physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. She'd started working late, coming home after 9 with takeout she'd already eaten, her phone always face down on the counter, her showers lasting 30 minutes when they used to take 10. I'd asked her once if everything was okay, if we were okay, and she'd smiled that smile that didn't reach her eyes and told me I worried too much, told me work was just stressful, told me to trust her. So I did, or I tried to, or I wanted to. But that night when I installed the cameras while she was at her sister's place, I felt something cold settle into my stomach, something that whispered this wasn't about burglars at all. The footage loaded slowly, buffering in segments that made my heart slam against my ribs with each passing second. I could see our living room in grainy night vision, the couch we'd picked out together at Ashley Furniture, the coffee table I'd built from a kit, the family photos on the wall that suddenly felt like lies. There was movement near the back door, a shadow that separated itself from the darkness and became a person, became a man, became someone who knew how to move through my house without turning on lights. My throat closed up as I watched him walk toward the couch, watched him sit down like he'd done it before, watched him pull out his phone and text someone, the blue light illuminating a face I couldn't quite make out but felt I should recognize. Then I heard it through my earbuds, faint but unmistakable, a voice from somewhere off camera, a voice that made my blood turn to ice. Malik won't be back till morning. It was Tasha, her voice low and amused, and I heard a man's laugh in response, deep and comfortable, the laugh of someone who felt safe in my home. I sat up in bed, my whole body rigid, and looked at my wife sleeping next to me. Her face peaceful in the dim light from the hallway, and I couldn't reconcile the woman beside me with the voice I'd just heard. The camera angle didn't show her, only caught the edge of her shadow moving across the floor, but I knew her voice like I knew my own heartbeat, and there was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no other explanation. She was down there with him while I was up here sleeping, or supposed to be sleeping, or trusted enough to sleep while my world fell apart 1 floor below. I wanted to get up, wanted to run downstairs, wanted to scream and break things and demand answers, but something stopped me, some instinct that told me silence would serve me better than rage. I adjusted the brightness on my phone, zoomed in on the frozen frame, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. A man's hand, reaching toward where Tasha's voice had come from, fingers disappearing into what must have been her hair, the gesture intimate and familiar and devastating. My chest felt like it was caving in, like someone had reached through my ribs and squeezed until there was no air left, no room for breath or thought or anything except the image of another man touching my wife. I'd loved Tasha since we were 23, met her at a 4th of July cookout, married her 2 years later in front of everybody we knew, promised her everything I had and everything I'd ever be. She'd promised me the same. Standing in that church with tears in her eyes, her hand in mine, her voice steady when she said the words that were supposed to mean forever. But forever had apparently come with conditions I didn't know about, with exceptions and escape clauses, and another man's hand in her hair, while I slept upstairs like a fool. My name is Malik Johnson, and this is my revenge story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just lay there staring at the ceiling while Tasha breathed peacefully beside me, and every minute felt like an hour. The sun came up slow and orange through our bedroom window, the same window we'd stood in front of when we first toured this house, when she'd squeezed my hand and said this was it. This was home. Now that light felt accusatory, exposing, like it was revealing truths I'd been too blind or too trusting to see before. When Tasha's alarm went off at 6:30, she rolled over and kissed my shoulder like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been downstairs with another man 5 hours earlier, and I had to force myself not to pull away. I got up, went through the motions of making coffee, of toasting bread, of being the husband I'd always been, while inside I was screaming, crumbling, calculating what to do next. She left for work at 7:15, her goodbye casual and distracted, and the moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I was on my laptop reviewing every second of footage from all 4 cameras. The living room camera had caught the most, but the back door camera showed him arriving at 2:33, showed him using a key to let himself in, a key he shouldn't have had, a key Tasha must have given him. I watched him walk through my house with confidence, no hesitation, no fear of being caught, and that hurt almost as much as everything else. This wasn't new, wasn't a mistake, wasn't a moment of weakness. It was routine, practiced, comfortable. The kitchen camera caught them briefly as they moved from the living room, and I finally got a clear look at his profile, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Reggie Morrison lived 4 houses down, had lived there for 3 years, was always out front washing his car or mowing his lawn or waving hello when I drove past. He was married to Simone, a nurse who worked night shifts, had 2 daughters I'd seen riding bikes up and down the street, and he'd been to our house for neighborhood cookouts, had shaken my hand, had drunk my beer, had complimented Tasha's potato salad while apparently planning to sleep with her. I thought about every interaction I'd had with him, every casual conversation about the Braves or the weather or the property values, and I wanted to be sick. He'd looked me in the eye knowing what he was doing, knowing he was betraying not just his own wife, but me, his neighbor, someone who'd never done anything but be friendly and trusting. The rage that rose in me was volcanic, but it was cold, too, controlled, turning into something harder than anger, something that felt like purpose. I kept watching the footage, forcing myself to see it all, to not look away from the truth no matter how much it hurt. At one point, Tasha's voice came through clearly again, saying something that made Reggie laugh, and then she said words that would echo in my head for weeks afterward. "He never checks anything, Reg. He's too busy trying to keep up with bills. He doesn't even notice when I come home late anymore." Her tone was affectionate when she said it. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive, like I was a problem she'd solved rather than a person she'd promised to love. I'd been working 60-hour weeks as an electrician, taking every overtime shift I could get, trying to build us a better life, trying to save enough for the vacation she kept saying she wanted, and apparently all I'd done was give her time and space to betray me. The video got harder to watch as they moved toward our bedroom, but the angle cut off before I could see them enter, and for that I was grateful because I don't know if I could have survived seeing them in our bed. But I didn't need to see it to know it happened. To know this had been happening, maybe for months, maybe longer. I thought about all the times I'd come home to find her freshly showered in the middle of the day, all the times the sheets smelled like laundry detergent when I knew I hadn't washed them, all the times she'd been too tired for me but apparently had plenty of energy for Reggie Morrison. The evidence had been there all along, written in small details I'd been too trusting or too tired or too in love to see clearly. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at the frozen image on my screen. Reggie's face caught in profile, looking toward where Tasha stood off camera. Something shifted in me then, something fundamental and permanent, like a bone breaking and setting wrong, creating a new shape I'd have to learn to live with. I wasn't going to confront them, wasn't going to scream or throw things or give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd broken me. I was going to watch, document, plan, and when the time was right, I was going to make sure they both understood exactly what they'd lost. I closed the laptop, got dressed for work, and drove to my first job site of the day with my hands steady on the wheel and murder playing soft and patient in my heart. The job that morning was a rewire in a basement in Buckhead, and I worked with a precision that surprised even me, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. My apprentice Deshaun kept glancing at me sideways, probably sensing something was off, but he knew better than to ask, and I was grateful for the silence. I spent 8 hours running cable and installing outlets while my mind ran calculations of a different kind, mapping out what I knew and what I needed to know, what I could prove and what I could use. When I got home that evening, Tasha was already there, cooking dinner like she did most nights when she wasn't working late, and the normalcy of it was obscene, offensive, a performance I now understood had been going on for longer than I could measure. We ate together at the kitchen table, her talking about her day at the salon where she did hair, complaining about a difficult client, asking about my work, and I responded with the right words at the right times while studying her face for cracks in the mask. She was good, I'd give her that, her smile easy, her eyes clear, no guilt showing through the surface, and I wondered if she'd always been this good at lying or if it was a skill she'd developed recently. After dinner, I told her I was tired and went upstairs early, but instead of sleeping, I pulled out my laptop and went through the footage again, this time with a notepad, documenting times and dates, creating a record that would be useful later, though I wasn't yet sure how. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before, something small but significant, a detail that added another layer to the betrayal. In one frame, when Reggie was sitting on our couch waiting for Tasha, there was something on the coffee table that hadn't been there when I left for work that morning, a small shape I couldn't quite make out in the grainy footage. I downloaded the video file and used software to enhance the image, adjusting the contrast until the object became clear. It was a beer bottle, a specific brand we didn't keep in our house because Tasha always said it tasted like garbage, but I'd seen that same brand in Reggie's recycling bin when I'd walked past his house taking out the trash. He'd brought his own beer, brought it into my house, drunk it while waiting for my wife, and left the bottle there like a calling card, like evidence of his presence that Tasha must have cleaned up before I got home. I felt sick, but also strangely energized, each new detail adding fuel to something cold and methodical growing inside me. I went downstairs after Tasha was asleep and checked under the couch cushions, between the seats, anywhere something might have fallen or been forgotten in the rush to cover tracks. My fingers touched something metal and I pulled it out into the light, my heart rate spiking. It was a bracelet, gold-plated and cheap-looking, with a name engraved on the flat surface of the band. Reggie. The letters stared up at me from my palm. Undeniable and damning. Physical proof that connected him to this house, to this couch, to this betrayal. I stood there in my dark living room holding another man's jewelry and felt something in me go very still and very cold. I took photos of the bracelet from every angle, then put it back exactly where I'd found it, evidence preserved for when I'd need it. Walking back upstairs felt like moving through water, everything slow and surreal, and when I slid back into bed next to Tasha, she murmured something in her sleep and reached for me, her hand landing on my chest the way it had 1,000 times before. I let her hand stay there, let her think everything was normal, let her believe I was still the trusting fool who worked himself to exhaustion while she destroyed our marriage 4 houses away from her own bedroom. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it finally did, I dreamed of electricity, of circuits closing and opening, of current finding its path from source to ground. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and lay there thinking about Reggie Morrison, about his wife Simone working night shifts at Grady Memorial while her husband visited my house, about his 2 daughters who deserved better than a father who snuck around in the dark. I thought about confronting him directly, about walking down the street and putting my fist through his face, but that would only satisfy me for a minute and cost me everything afterward. No, this required patience, strategy, the kind of careful planning I used when mapping electrical systems, finding the weak points, knowing exactly where to cut to make the whole thing come down. I got up and went to work, and all day while I pulled wire and crimped connections I was building a different kind of circuit in my head, one that would light up their world in ways they wouldn't see coming until it was too late to stop. Sunday came around like it always did, and our neighborhood had its monthly cookout in the Hendersons' backyard, the same gathering I'd been attending for 5 years without knowing I was the joke everyone else was in on. I grilled burgers and hot dogs while Tasha stood with the other wives drinking wine, and I watched Reggie Morrison across the yard playing cornhole with Marcus from 2 streets over, his laugh loud and easy, his whole posture radiating the confidence of a man who thought he'd gotten away with something. Simone was there too, looking tired in her scrubs because she'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift, and when Reggie kissed her cheek in greeting, I had to look away before the rage showed on my face. He was good at this, at playing the devoted husband and father, at fitting seamlessly into neighborhood gatherings while maintaining a second life in secret. I was flipping burgers when Reggie walked over with 2 beers, and that same brand I'd seen in the footage, and handed me one with a grin that made my skin crawl. "How you doing, Malik?" he asked, leaning against the grill like we were old friends, like he hadn't been inside my house 4 nights ago, touching my wife. I took the beer because refusing would have been suspicious, took a drink because I needed something to do with my hands besides wrap them around his throat. We talked about the upcoming Falcon season, about the heat, about nothing that mattered, and the whole time I was studying him, noting the way his eyes flickered toward Tasha every few minutes, the way he smiled when she laughed at something Keisha said, the proprietary interest he couldn't quite hide. He thought he was clever, thought he was getting away with it, and maybe he had been until I installed those cameras. Then I noticed something that made my blood go cold and hot at the same time, a detail so brazen it took my breath away. Reggie was wearing a watch, a nice silver citizen that caught the sunlight, and I recognized it immediately because I'd bought it for Tasha last Christmas, spent 2 weeks overtime pay on it, wrapped it myself, and watched her face light up when she opened it. She'd worn it for a month and then said the clasp was broken, said she'd get it fixed, and I'd forgotten about it in the chaos of daily life. But there it was on Reggie Morrison's wrist, my gift to my wife now adorning the arm of the man she was sleeping with, the ultimate insult wrapped in casual Sunday afternoon normalcy. He saw me looking at it and had the audacity to show it off. Said Simone got it for him for his birthday, said it kept perfect time, and I smiled and nodded and told him it looked good while inside I was screaming. I excused myself and went inside the Hendersons' house to their bathroom, locked the door, and stood there gripping the sink while I tried to breathe through the fury. The watch was worse than the bracelet somehow, more personal, more calculated, because it meant Tasha had given him something I'd chosen for her, something meant to symbolize my love and commitment, and turned it into a trophy for her lover. I splashed water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror, saw the lines that had appeared around my eyes from working too much, from stress, from being so focused on providing that I'd missed what was happening in my own house. The man looking back at me looked tired and older than 32, but his eyes had changed, had gone hard in a way they'd never been before. When I came back outside, Reggie was talking to Tasha, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and nobody else seemed to notice or care. I watched them for a full minute, studying their body language, the way they angled toward each other, the micro-expressions that spoke of intimacy and inside jokes. Then Tasha's eyes met mine across the yard and she smiled, that bright public smile she used at these gatherings, and I smiled back, raised my beer in a small salute, and watched uncertainty flicker across her face for just a second before she recovered. Good, I thought. Let her wonder. Let her start to question whether I knew. Let the paranoia creep in the way it had been creeping into me for weeks before I found proof. The cookout lasted until sunset, and I played my part perfectly. The friendly neighbor, the devoted husband, the hardworking electrician who was too busy and too tired to notice anything wrong. When we finally walked home, just 4 houses down the street, Tasha linked her arm through mine and told me it was a nice day, and I agreed because it cost me nothing to agree. Because every word she spoke now was just data, just evidence, just rope she was weaving into her own noose. That night, I lay awake again while she slept, and I thought about that watch on Reggie's wrist, about him checking the time my money had paid for while planning when to next enter my house, and I felt something settle into place, a resolution that was cold and clear and patient. He wanted to wear my gift, wanted to parade it around in front of me. Then he could wear it while I took everything from him that mattered. Monday morning, I stopped at Best Buy before my first job and bought 2 more cameras, smaller ones, the kind you could hide in plain sight, disguised as phone chargers and smoke detectors. The kid who helped me was maybe 19 and kept trying to upsell me on features I didn't need, and I just nodded and paid cash and left before he could ask questions about why someone needed 6 cameras for home security. I installed the new ones that evening while Tasha was at work, one in our bedroom tucked inside an alarm clock, another in the garage where the back door camera had a blind spot, and I synced them all to my phone so I could watch in real time from anywhere. The technology felt like a violation even as I was the one installing it. But I'd been violated first, had my trust and my marriage destroyed without my consent, so I swallowed the guilt and finished the job. The footage started coming in immediately. Hours of mundane domestic activity that I watched in fast forward, Tasha moving through the house, sometimes on her phone laughing at messages I'd never see, sometimes just sitting on the couch staring at nothing with an expression I couldn't read. On Wednesday, she came home early, around 2 in the afternoon, and I was on a job site in Marietta when the motion alert hit my phone. I stepped away from Deshawn and pulled up the live feed, watched Tasha walk through the house checking windows, making sure everything was clear, and then she sent a text, and less than 5 minutes later Reggie Morrison was letting himself in the back door with that key I still hadn't confronted her about. My hands shook as I held the phone, crouched behind my work van, watching them embrace in my kitchen like lovers in a movie, like this was romance instead of betrayal. They moved to the living room and I switched camera angles, following them through my house, through my life, watching them destroy everything I'd built with casual ease. Reggie said something that made Tasha laugh, that real laugh she used to give me when I'd say something stupid but charming, and she hit his shoulder playfully and told him to stop. Then they sat on the couch, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, and they just talked for a while, comfortable and familiar, and somehow that hurt worse than if they'd immediately gone to the bedroom. This was intimate in a way that transcended physical betrayal. This was emotional connection. This was her sharing parts of herself with him that used to belong to me, and I felt something crack in my chest that I wasn't sure would ever heal. The audio came through clear on my earbuds, and I heard her say words that would play on repeat in my head for days afterward. "He never even noticed the watch was gone, Reg. I told you he doesn't pay attention to anything but work these days." Reggie's response was too quiet to hear, but Tasha laughed again and continued. "He's a good man. He really is. He works so hard and he loves me. But it's like living with a ghost, you know? He's never really here even when he's here." She sighed, and I heard fabric rustle as she shifted position. "With you, it's different. You see me, you know? You make me feel alive again." I wanted to throw the phone, wanted to scream, wanted to drive home right then and tear my house apart, but I just kept watching, kept listening, kept documenting every word for later. They stayed for 2 hours, and I watched it all. Every minute I should have been working, but couldn't focus on anything except the betrayal unfolding on my screen. At one point, Tasha said something that made everything click into a new shape in my head. "Malik thinks you're such a good guy, always talks about what a solid neighbor you are, how Simone's lucky to have you." She laughed, and the cruelty in it was casual, unintentional, which somehow made it worse. If he only knew, right? If he knew you were here in his house, in his bed, wearing his watch. Reggie said something I couldn't hear, and Tasha responded, "He won't ever know, baby. He trusts me too much, and he's too busy trying to keep up with bills to notice anything anyway." I saved the recording, backed it up to 3 different locations, and sat there behind my van feeling like I'd been hollowed out and filled with something heavy and dark. Deshawn found me 20 minutes later and asked if I was okay, said I looked sick, and I told him my stomach was messed up, that I needed to head home. I didn't go home, though. I drove to my Aunt Renee's house in East Atlanta, the woman who'd raised me after my mother passed when I was 14, the only person I trusted to hear this without judgment or platitudes. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside, and I sat at her kitchen table the same way I had as a teenager when life felt impossible, and I told her everything. Auntie Renee listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold while I talked, her face unreadable in that way she had when she was thinking deep. She was 68 but looked 50, her hair gray but her eyes sharp, and she'd survived her own husband's betrayal 30 years ago when I was just a baby, so she knew this particular kind of pain in ways most people didn't. When I finally finished talking, my voice hoarse from the effort of staying controlled, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment, and I felt like that lost 14-year-old again, desperate for someone to tell me what to do, how to survive this. "How long you planning to sit on this before you do something?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, and I realized I'd been expecting her to tell me to forgive, to work it out, to consider marriage counseling like people always suggested when they didn't understand that some things couldn't be fixed. I shook my head because I didn't have an answer, didn't have a plan beyond document and suffer, and she reached across the table and took my hand the way she used to when I was young and scared. "Listen to me, baby," she said, her grip firm and grounding. "What Tasha did, what that man did, that's on them. That's their sin to carry. But how you respond, that's on you. That's what defines who you are when the dust settles." She got up and poured fresh tea for both of us, moving slowly through her kitchen that smelled like the same lemon furniture polish she'd used since I was a kid. "When your Uncle Charles did what he did," she started, sitting back down, "I wanted to burn his whole life down, wanted everyone to know what kind of man he really was, wanted him to hurt the way he hurt me." She paused and took a sip of tea, her eyes distant with memory. "So I told everyone, made a scene at his job, called his mama, made sure the whole neighborhood knew he was a cheater and a liar." She looked at me then, her expression sad and knowing. "You know what happened? Everyone felt sorry for me for about 2 weeks, and then I became that bitter woman who couldn't let go, and Charles just moved on with his secretary and I was stuck with all that rage and nowhere to put it. I wanted to argue, wanted to say my situation was different, but something in her story made me pause, made me think about what I actually wanted from all this beyond just making Tasha hurt." Auntie Renee leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "Revenge, don't scream, baby. It whispers." She let that sit between us for a moment, then continued. "You want them to hurt? Don't give them the satisfaction of knowing they got to you. Don't give them a scene they can use to make you look crazy or bitter or abusive. You stay quiet, you stay smart. You document everything like you've been doing, and when the time's right, you make your move so clean and so cold they won't even know what hit them till it's too late to fix." We talked for another hour about strategy and timing, about legal implications and financial planning, about protecting myself while ensuring they faced consequences that mattered. She told me to open a separate bank account they couldn't track, to start moving money slowly so Tasha wouldn't notice, to make copies of every important document in case things got ugly. She told me to keep going to work, keep playing the dutiful husband, keep my face neutral and my voice calm no matter what I saw on those cameras. "You want to win this?" she asked as I was leaving, her hand on my shoulder at her front door. "Then you play the long game, you think 3 moves ahead, and you make sure that when it's over, you're the one standing while they're picking up pieces." I drove home as the sun was setting, the sky orange and purple over Atlanta's skyline, and I felt different than I had that morning, more focused, more purposeful. Auntie Renee was right. Screaming wouldn't help. Confronting them now would only put them on guard, but patience and planning could give me everything I needed. When I got home, Tasha was making dinner, and she kissed me when I walked in, asked where I'd been, and I told her I'd stop by Auntie Renee's to fix her garbage disposal. The lie came easy, natural, and I realized I'd already started playing the game Auntie Renee had described, already started building a version of myself who could function in this house while planning its dismantling. That night, after Tasha went to sleep, I sat in my truck in the driveway and created a new email account, something generic and untraceable, and I started organizing all the footage I'd collected into a private cloud drive. Every video, every screenshot, every timestamp, all of it categorized and backed up where Tasha couldn't access it even if she somehow figured out I knew. I wrote down dates and times, made a spreadsheet of their meetings, noted every lie Tasha had told me about working late or running errands. The process was mechanical and soothing, turning my pain into data, my betrayal into evidence, and when I finally went inside at midnight I felt calmer than I had in weeks, armed with purpose instead of just drowning in hurt. The next week, I stopped at Home Depot and bought tools I didn't need for jobs I'd never do, but the receipt said electrical supplies and wire, things that made sense for my work, and I paid cash. What I actually bought was 2 more cameras, the smallest ones they sold, the kind people used for nanny cams, and I installed them that Friday while Tasha was at her mother's helping with some problem that probably wasn't real. The first one went in the garage, hidden inside a box of holiday decorations on a shelf where it had a clear view of the back door and the entrance to the house. The second one went in our bedroom, tucked behind picture frames on the dresser, angled to capture the bed and door, a second viewpoint to eliminate blind spots since I already had a hidden alarm clock camera there. The cameras worked perfectly, feeding live footage to an app on my phone that I checked obsessively, constantly, during every break at work and every moment alone. I watched Tasha move through our house when she thought she was unobserved, saw her on phone calls where she laughed and whispered, saw her try on outfits and take photos in the mirror, saw her living a life that didn't include me except as an obstacle to work around. On Tuesday, she came home from the salon and immediately texted someone, and 20 minutes later, Reggie Morrison was in my house again, and this time I had angles I'd never had before, footage that showed everything clearly, undeniably, permanently. They went to the bedroom, my bedroom, the bed I'd been sleeping in every night, and I watched from my truck parked at a gas station 3 miles away, my lunch getting cold in the seat next to me while my marriage died on a 5-inch screen. I started acting different at home after that, not dramatically, just subtly pulling back, being quiet where I used to ask questions, being distant where I used to be affectionate. When Tasha asked what was wrong, I told her I was tired, stressed about work, worried about money, all true things that mask the deeper truth I couldn't speak yet. She seemed relieved by the explanation, relieved I wasn't suspicious, and she stopped trying to engage me in conversation, stopped trying to maintain the pretense of a happy marriage. We became roommates who barely spoke, who existed in separate orbits under the same roof, and I could tell she was grateful for the space because it made her betrayal easier, made her time with Reggie less complicated by guilt or fear of discovery. At work, I started taking longer lunch breaks, using the time to organize my evidence, to research divorce lawyers, to plan next steps in a way that wouldn't leave me vulnerable. I opened a new bank account at a credit union across town, somewhere Tasha had no connection to, and I started having my overtime pay deposited there, money she didn't know about, money I'd need when everything fell apart. Deshaun noticed I was distracted, but he'd learned not to push, just picked up the slack when I zoned out staring at wire I was supposed to be stripping. I was grateful for his silence, for the way he just let me work through whatever he thought I was working through, not knowing it was the systematic dismantling of my entire life. One evening I came home early, deliberately, without telling Tasha I was coming, and I found her in the shower at 4 p.m, her hair wet and her skin flushed, and the bed was made but made wrong, the comforter tucked in a way I knew wasn't how I'd left it that morning. She jumped when she saw me, actually startled, and covered it by saying she'd gotten paint in her hair at work, had to wash it out immediately, and I nodded and said nothing, just went to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich while she finished showering. The back door camera showed Reggie leaving 8 minutes before I'd arrived, showed him slipping out through the yard toward the street, and I realized he must have his own alert system, must have Tasha warning him when I was close, and the level of planning involved in their affair was impressive in its thoroughness. That night, I lay in bed next to my wife and thought about the fact that Reggie Morrison had been in this same bed hours earlier. that the sheets had been changed, but the betrayal remained, soaked into the mattress and the walls and the air I was breathing. Tasha reached for me in the darkness, her hand finding my shoulder, and I let her touch me because pulling away would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. She asked if I was okay, said I'd been distant lately, and I told her I was fine. Just tired, just stressed, just working through things, and she accepted that because it was easy to accept, because it let her off the hook from having to actually care. She fell asleep within minutes, her breathing evening out, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about keys and cameras and watches and all the small ways a person could betray you while sleeping peacefully at your side. Friday night, Tasha told me she was going out with her girlfriends, some birthday thing for Keisha, and she'd be home late, and I told her to have fun, gave her money for drinks, kissed her cheek like a good husband. I watched her drive away in the car I'd helped her buy, wearing the earrings I'd given her for our anniversary, and then I went inside and pulled up the camera feeds on my laptop, settled in with a cold beer, and waited. The text to Reggie must have gone out before she even left our driveway because he was at my back door within 15 minutes, letting himself in with that key, moving through my house like he owned it. This time he brought a bottle of wine, expensive stuff I recognized from Costco, and he set it on the counter and looked around like he was waiting for something, for someone, for my wife to finish whatever lie she'd told her friends so she could come back to him. Tasha showed up 40 minutes later, enough time to have actually gone to meet Keisha and then make an excuse to leave. And when she walked through that back door, Reggie pulled her into his arms and kissed her in my kitchen, in the space where we'd eaten breakfast that morning, and I watched it all in high definition from 6 different angles. They laughed about something, opened the wine, and sat on my couch like this was their house, their Friday night, their life together. I could hear everything through the audio feed, their conversation casual and intimate, talking about his daughter's soccer games and Tasha's problems with a client at the salon, domestic details that should have been mine to hear, mine to care about. But I'd been replaced and hadn't even known it until it was too late. The night wore on and I watched every minute, forcing myself not to look away, not to spare myself any detail of what they were doing in my home. They moved to the bedroom around 11, and the new camera I'd installed captured everything, and I sat there in my truck parked 2 blocks away and watched my wife with another man in the bed where I slept every night. The betrayal was complete, total, undeniable, and something in me finally broke free from the last chains of hope or denial or whatever had been holding me back from fully accepting what I needed to do. I saved the footage, backed it up, labeled it with date and time stamps, and felt nothing but cold determination settle into my bones like frost, permanent and numbing. They fell asleep afterward, both of them, tangled together in my sheets, and I sat in my truck until 2 a.m. just watching them sleep, studying their faces in the grainy night vision, memorizing this image for later when I'd need to remember why I did what I was about to do. Reggie left around 3, kissing Tasha goodbye at the back door, promising to text her tomorrow, and she watched him go with a smile that made her look younger, happier, more alive than I'd seen her look in months. Then she was alone, and she went through the house straightening up, erasing evidence, changing the sheets again, spraying air freshener to cover the smell of wine and cologne, and her efficiency at covering her tracks told me this was routine, practiced, that I'd been living in a carefully maintained lie for longer than I could probably ever know. Tasha texted me at 3:30 saying she was staying at Keisha's because she'd had too much to drink, and I texted back telling her to be safe, adding a heart emoji because that's what the old Malik would have done, the trusting Malik who believed his wife when she spoke. I drove home and let myself in through the front door, walked through my house smelling air freshener and seeing fresh sheets on the bed, and I smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with clarity. I knew exactly what I was dealing with now, knew the full scope and scale of the betrayal, and knowledge was power, information was leverage, and I had more of both than Tasha or Reggie could possibly imagine. I went to my laptop and created a new folder, labeled it Insurance in case anyone ever saw it, and I compiled the best footage, the clearest videos, the most damning evidence of everything they'd done. I had them entering and leaving, had audio of their conversations, had bedroom footage that left nothing to interpretation, and I organized it all chronologically, professionally, like I was building a case for trial. Then I burned it all to 3 separate flash drives, put one in my truck's glove box, one in my work locker, and one in a safety deposit box I'd rented that week at the credit union, and I felt like a man preparing for war, armored and ready, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Saturday morning, Tasha came home around 8, looking appropriately tired and hungover, and I made her eggs and coffee like a devoted husband, asked how Keisha's birthday was, listened to her lies about going to a club in Midtown and dancing until her feet hurt. She was good at lying, I'd give her that, her details specific and consistent, her body language open and relaxed, and if I hadn't watched her spend the night in our bed with Reggie Morrison, I would have believed every word. Instead, I smiled and nodded and told her I was glad she had fun, that she deserved a night out, that I knew she worked hard and needed to relax sometimes. She looked at me with something like gratitude, maybe even affection, and I realized she actually believed I was that stupid, that trusting, that easy to deceive. That afternoon, while Tasha was napping off her fake hangover, I went to Office Depot and printed photos. Not all of them, just a carefully curated selection that told the story without being pornographic, because I needed evidence, not revenge porn. The clerk who helped me was a young woman who glanced at the first few images as they came out of the printer and then looked at me with such pity I almost lost my composure. But I just thanked her and paid cash and left with my manila envelope full of proof. I drove to Auntie Renee's house and showed her everything, spread the photos on her kitchen table like cards in a poker game, and she studied each one carefully, her face hard and angry in a way I rarely saw. "This is more than enough," she said finally, gathering the photos back into a neat stack. "You could go to a lawyer Monday morning and be done with this by the end of the month." I nodded because I knew that, had already consulted with a divorce attorney during my lunch break Thursday, had learned about Georgia's laws and what evidence would hold up in court and how to protect myself financially. But Auntie Renee knew me too well, saw something in my face that made her pause. "But you're not going to do that yet, are you?" she asked, and I shook my head because I wasn't, because divorce would only punish Tasha, and I needed Reggie to face consequences too, needed his wife to know what kind of man she'd married, needed his daughters to understand their father wasn't the hero he pretended to be. We talked strategy for 2 hours, Auntie Renee helping me think through every angle, every potential complication, every way this could backfire if I wasn't careful. She reminded me that Simone worked nights, that she deserved to know the truth but also deserved to hear it in a way that wouldn't destroy her in public, that there were kids involved who didn't ask for any of this. I listened and adjusted my plan, making it tighter, cleaner, more focused on justice than just blind revenge. When I left her house, I had a timeline, 3 weeks to gather any final evidence I might need, to secure my finances, to prepare for the aftermath of what I was about to unleash. 3 weeks to be the perfect husband while planning the perfect exit. The following week passed in a strange blur of normalcy and preparation, me going to work and coming home and eating dinner with Tasha like we were still a real couple, still people who loved each other, still building a future together. She seemed happier, more relaxed, probably because I'd stopped asking questions, stopped being present enough to notice anything suspicious, and her increased comfort meant she got sloppy, less careful about covering tracks. I documented everything, every late arrival home, every shower in the middle of the day, every text message she thought I couldn't see when her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was building a fortress of evidence, brick by brick, and she had no idea she was helping me construct her own prison. On Thursday night, I came home early again, this time completely by accident because a job got canceled, and I found Tasha in the driveway on her phone, her face flushed and angry, and when she saw me, she hung up quickly and forced a smile. "Hey, baby," she said, too bright, too cheerful. "I thought you were working late." I told her about the cancellation, and she nodded, her eyes flickering toward the house in a way that made my instincts scream. I went inside casually, dropped my work bag by the door, and I could smell cologne in the air, strong and recent. the same scent Reggie wore that I'd noticed at the neighborhood cookout. The back door was unlocked, which was unusual, and when I checked the camera footage later, I'd see him leaving through the yard 2 minutes before I pulled into the driveway. That night, while Tasha slept, I sat in my truck and watched all the footage from that day. Saw Reggie arrive at 2 in the afternoon, saw them together for 3 hours, saw him leave in a panic when Tasha must have texted him I was coming home early. The close call should have scared them, should have made them more careful or maybe even made them stop, but instead the next morning Tasha was texting him laughing about it, calling it a near miss, treating my early arrival like a joke instead of a warning. That's when I knew they'd gotten too comfortable, too confident in their ability to deceive me, and that overconfidence was going to be their downfall because people who thought they were untouchable stopped watching their backs. The next Monday, I went to work like normal, but took a long lunch to meet with the divorce attorney again, this time with all my evidence organized and ready to present. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she'd come highly recommended by a guy I'd worked with who'd gone through a messy divorce, and she sat across from me in her office looking at my photos and videos with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen worse. "This is very thorough," she said after reviewing everything. "Unusual for someone who just suspected. Most people come to me with hunches and maybe a few text messages." I told her I was an electrician, that I understood systems and circuits and how to document things properly, and she smiled in a way that was almost impressed. We talked through my options, what a divorce would look like, how the evidence would play in court, what I could expect in terms of settlement and timeline. Georgia was a no-fault divorce state, but adultery could still impact things like alimony and asset division, and with this much proof I was in a strong position to keep most of what I'd earned. Patricia asked if there were any children, and I shook my head, grateful for that small mercy because at least no kids would be caught in this explosion. She drew up preliminary paperwork, told me to think hard about next steps, reminded me that sometimes the best revenge was just moving on and living well. I thanked her for the advice and told her I'd be in touch, but we both knew I'd already made my decision weeks ago. That evening I got home before Tasha and found something that stopped me cold in the kitchen doorway. There was a vase of flowers on the counter, roses, expensive ones, and they definitely hadn't been there that morning when I left for work. I checked the card, and it said, "Just because," in handwriting I didn't recognize. And my first thought was that Reggie had gotten bold enough to send my wife flowers to our house. But then I realized that didn't make sense because he'd never risk something that obvious. I pulled up the camera footage on my phone and watched Tasha come home early, watched her arrange the flowers herself, watched her write the card in her own handwriting but making it look different, watched her create evidence of a thoughtful husband who didn't exist anymore. The manipulation of it hit me harder than I expected. This theatrical performance for herself, or maybe for her friends if they came over, this false narrative of a marriage that was still working, still loving, still worthy of romantic gestures. She was rewriting our story in real time, creating a version of me that brought her flowers, while the real me was 20 feet away in my truck watching her construct the lie. I went inside and complimented the roses, asked who they were from, and she smiled and said I was terrible at keeping secrets, that she'd found the receipt in my wallet. I played along, said I'd wanted to surprise her, and she kissed me and told me I was sweet. And the whole interaction was so layered with deception I felt dizzy trying to track whose lie was on top. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was up on a ladder running wire through a ceiling, and I nearly dropped it when I saw it was Tasha, calling in the middle of the day, something she rarely did unless it was important. I climbed down and answered, and her voice was shaking, panicked, nothing like the controlled woman I'd been watching on camera for weeks. "Someone broke into the house," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "I came home for lunch and the back door was open and things are moved around and I don't know if they took anything, but I'm scared." I told her to call the police, that I'd be right there, and I drove home with my heart pounding but my mind clear and calculating. The police were already there when I arrived, a young officer taking Tasha's statement while she sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket like she was in shock. She ran to me when I walked in, threw her arms around me, and I held her while she explained what happened, how she'd come home and found the back door ajar, how she'd been too afraid to go inside until the police arrived. The officer asked if we had security cameras, and I said yes, that I'd installed them a few weeks ago, and Tasha's body went rigid in my arms for just a second before she recovered. "You installed cameras?" she asked, her voice careful, and I nodded, said I'd mentioned it to her, but maybe she forgot, that I'd wanted to keep us safe after all the break-ins in the neighborhood. The officer asked to see the footage, and I pulled out my phone, my hands steady, and I pulled up the camera app while Tasha watched over my shoulder, her breath quick and shallow against my neck. I made a show of scrolling through the timeline, looking at today's date, and I could feel her vibrating with tension, probably terrified about what the footage might show, what the police might see, what I might see. Then I stopped and frowned, genuinely confused for a moment before I understood what had happened. "That's strange," I said, showing the officer. "There's nothing here, no footage at all from today, like the cameras were offline." I looked at Tasha, and her face was pale but relieved, and that's when I knew she'd figured out the cameras existed and had tried to disable them. Probably texted Reggie to stay away, probably panicked when she realized I'd been recording all along. The police found no evidence of a break-in, no forced entry, nothing missing, and they filed a report but told us it was probably kids checking doors, or maybe Tasha had just forgotten to lock up that morning. After they left, we sat on the couch together and I held her hand and told her everything would be okay, that the cameras would keep us safe, that whoever had tried to get in would be caught on video if they came back. She nodded but wouldn't meet my eyes, and I knew she was calculating, trying to figure out if I knew, how much I'd seen, whether she needed to confess or could still bluff her way through. I let the silence stretch, let her paranoia grow, and then I told her I was going to check all the cameras to make sure they were working properly, that maybe there was a technical glitch. I spent that evening in my truck reviewing footage she didn't know existed, the cameras she hadn't found because they were newer and better hidden, and I watched her after the police left, watched her frantically texting someone, watched her pace through the house checking every room, every corner, looking for cameras she'd missed. She found 2 of the original ones and unplugged them, but the other 4 kept recording, kept documenting her paranoia and her fear, and I saved all of it because fear was leverage. Fear was power. Fear meant she knew something was coming even if she didn't know what. That night she barely slept, kept getting up to check the doors and windows, and I pretended to sleep while watching her spiral through half-closed eyes. Friday morning I took a different approach, decided it was time to let Reggie know that his comfortable little secret wasn't as secure as he thought. I found him at his house, working in his garage on his car, and I walked down the street like I was just being neighborly, just stopping by to chat. He looked up when I approached, and his smile was friendly, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, some awareness that things had shifted, even if he couldn't name how. "Hey, Malik," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's up, man?" I told him about the break-in, how Tasha was shaken up, how I'd been reviewing our security footage to try to figure out what happened, and I watched his face carefully as I spoke. "Security footage?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice was too tight, too controlled, and I nodded, pulled out my phone like I was going to show him something. Instead of showing him the app, I opened my photos and found the picture I'd saved specifically for this moment. A screenshot from the bedroom camera, crystal clear, showing him and Tasha together in my bed. I held it up without saying anything. Just let him look at it. Let him see himself captured and documented and caught. The color drained from his face and he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And I just stood there watching him realize that everything he'd thought was hidden had been visible all along, that I'd known for weeks and had been letting him dig his hole deeper. "I'm not going to fight you," I said quietly, my voice level and cold. "I'm not going to cause a scene or throw punches or do anything that would make you sympathetic." I put my phone back in my pocket and looked him in the eye. Let him see what he'd created in me, what his betrayal and arrogance had forged. "But you're going to tell Simone yourself tonight, and you're going to be honest about how long this has been going on, because if you don't, I will, and I have pictures and videos that will make sure she believes every word." Reggie tried to say something, tried to negotiate or threaten or maybe apologize, but I turned and walked away, left him standing in his garage with his whole life crumbling around him. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to a coffee shop across town and sent an email from my anonymous account to Simone's work email, the one listed on Grady Memorial's website for the nursing staff. The subject line was just her name, and the message was simple. "Your husband has been having an affair with my wife. He has until tonight to tell you himself. If he doesn't, I'm attaching evidence." I included one photo. Nothing explicit, but clear enough that there was no mistaking what was happening, and I hit send before I could second-guess myself. This wasn't about destroying Simone, wasn't about hurting someone innocent, but she deserved to know who she was married to, deserved the chance to make her own choices with full information. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered to hear Reggie's voice, desperate and angry, telling me I had no right to ruin his life, that his wife was devastated, that his daughters were crying and asking questions he couldn't answer. "You did this," I said, my voice cutting through his excuses. "You made these choices. You thought you'd never face consequences, and now you are." He tried to bargain, offered me money to keep quiet about the extent of it, to not let it spread through the neighborhood, but I'd never wanted his money, never wanted anything from him except for him to understand what he'd taken from me. I hung up while he was still talking, blocked his number, and sat in my truck feeling nothing but cold satisfaction that his comfortable lie was finally catching fire. By Saturday morning, the neighborhood knew something had happened between Reggie and Simone, because their screaming match had woken up half the street Friday night, and the gossip was already flowing through text chains and over fences. I stayed home that day, watching Tasha watch her phone, seeing messages come in that she wouldn't let me see, her face getting paler and more frightened as the hours passed. She knew Reggie had been caught, probably knew I was involved somehow, but she didn't know how much I knew about her own involvement, didn't know whether to confess or deny or run. Around noon, she asked me if I'd heard what happened with Reggie and Simone, trying to sound casual and concerned, and I told her I'd heard something about a fight but didn't know details. "Apparently, Reggie was cheating," she said, watching my face for reaction, and I just shook my head and said that was terrible, that poor Simone didn't deserve that I couldn't imagine being betrayed by someone you trusted. Tasha flinched at the word betrayed but covered it quickly, agreed that it was awful, that some people had no honor, and the irony of her words hung in the air between us like smoke. I told her I was going to the hardware store, that I'd be back in a few hours, and I left her sitting on our couch with her phone and her fear, probably texting Reggie to find out how much he'd told his wife, how much danger she was in, whether her own secrets were about to explode. I didn't go to the hardware store. I went to my storage unit across town where I'd been keeping a suitcase for the past week, packed with Tasha's clothes and belongings, everything I wanted out of my house before the final confrontation. I'd done it methodically over several days, taking things she wouldn't immediately miss, filling the suitcase with her life so I could hand it to her and tell her to leave. Inside the suitcase, I placed an envelope, sealed and labeled with her name, and inside that envelope was a letter I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to find words that captured everything I felt without giving her the satisfaction of knowing she'd broken me completely. The letter was simple in the end, just a few lines that said everything that mattered. "You taught me what love isn't. You taught me that trust can be weaponized, that marriage vows are just words some people say without meaning them, that I was building a life with someone who was actively destroying it behind my back. Thank you for the lesson. The cameras caught everything. Don't come back to this house. Your belongings are here. The divorce papers will follow. I won't tell people what you did, but you'll leave this neighborhood and you'll leave me alone. And if you don't, everyone will know what kind of person you really are." I hope he was worth it. I didn't sign it with love, didn't sign it with my name, just left it unsigned because she'd know who it was from, know what it meant, know that this was the end. I drove home with the suitcase in my truck bed, and when I pulled into the driveway, Tasha's car was gone, and I felt a moment of panic that she'd already run, already figured out what was coming. But then I checked the cameras and saw she'd left 30 minutes earlier, probably going to meet Reggie or going to her mother's or just going anywhere that wasn't this house where the walls were closing in. I carried the suitcase to the front porch and left it there. Positioned it where she couldn't miss it when she came home, where it would be the first thing she saw, a physical manifestation of our marriage's end sitting by our welcome mat. Then I went inside and changed all the locks, something I'd planned for this moment. New hardware I'd bought weeks ago and kept in the garage waiting for the right time. It took me an hour to replace every lock in the house, every door and window, making sure no key she had would work anymore, making sure when she came home she'd find herself locked out of the life she'd destroyed. I gathered up the last few things of hers I found inside, photos and toiletries and small belongings, and I put them in a cardboard box and carried that to the porch too. By the time I was done, the sun was setting and our front porch looked like a yard sale of our failed marriage. Her life reduced to luggage and boxes, and I felt nothing but tired. I went inside my newly secured house and sat in the dark living room where this had all begun, where I'd first watched footage of her betraying me, and I waited for her to come home. She arrived around 8, her headlights sweeping across the front of the house, and I watched through the window as she parked and got out and saw the suitcase. She walked up to it slowly, like she was approaching something dangerous, and when she bent down and saw her name on the envelope, she stood there frozen for a long minute before opening it. I couldn't see her face clearly in the porch light, but I saw her body language change as she read, saw her shoulders collapse, saw her hand come up to her mouth, and I knew she understood that I knew everything, that her secrets were no longer secret, that the game was over. She tried to get in, tried her key and found it didn't work, and then she started calling my phone, but I'd already silenced it, already decided I wouldn't speak to her tonight or maybe ever again except through lawyers. She called 17 times in the first hour, left voicemails I wouldn't listen to, sent texts I wouldn't read, and eventually she gave up and loaded the suitcase and box into her car and drove away. I watched her taillights disappear down our street and felt something release in my chest, some pressure I'd been carrying for months finally lifting, leaving me hollow but also lighter. The house was mine again, truly mine, empty of her presence and her lies, and I walked through room cleaning and organizing, reclaiming space that had felt poisoned by betrayal. The divorce moved quickly once Patricia filed the papers, and Tasha didn't fight it, probably because she knew what evidence I had, knew that contesting anything would only make the details public. We split assets cleanly. She kept her car and her savings, I kept the house and mine, and she signed everything without argument. I never told anyone in the neighborhood the full story, never posted details or spread gossip, just let people draw their own conclusions when Tasha moved out and Reggie's marriage imploded around the same time. Some people asked, and I just said we'd grown apart, that it was amicable, that these things happened, and most people respected my privacy enough not to push. But I did post one thing, carefully crafted, to my Facebook the day the divorce was finalized. It was a photo of my living room, the same room where the first camera had captured everything, and the caption just said, "Security saved me." No explanation, no details, just those 3 words that could mean anything to anyone who didn't know the full story, but that Tasha would see and understand completely. The post got a few likes from friends and family, got a couple comments asking what I meant, and I never clarified, never responded, just left it there as a marker of the moment everything changed. I threw myself into work after that, took every job offered, worked evenings and weekends, rebuilt my savings and my sense of purpose. Deshaun noticed the change in me, said I seemed different, more focused, and I told him I'd gone through some things but was coming out the other side. He didn't push for details, but he worked harder to match my pace, and together we built a reputation for quality and reliability that started getting us bigger jobs, better clients, referrals that led to opportunities I'd never imagined. 6 months after the divorce was final, I had enough saved to put a down payment on a work van with my name on the side, enough to start thinking about hiring another apprentice, enough to imagine a future that wasn't just survival. Auntie Renee called every Sunday to check on me, to make sure I was eating and sleeping and not drowning in bitterness, and I could honestly tell her I was okay, that the anger had faded into something calmer, that I was building something new from the rubble of what had been destroyed. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled it, that revenge done right was about moving forward, not staying stuck, that the best punishment for people who betrayed you was to live well enough that they regretted losing you. I thought about that a lot, about whether Tasha regretted anything, but mostly I realized I didn't care anymore, that she'd become irrelevant to my life in the way she'd made me feel irrelevant to hers. 8 months after everything fell apart, I got a call from a woman named Denise, who ran a small property management company, and she asked if I'd be interested in bidding on a contract to handle electrical work for all 12 of her rental properties. It was the kind of steady, reliable income that could change everything, that could let me hire help and expand and build something lasting. I met with her at a coffee shop in Decatur, and we talked about vision and reliability and building trust, and she told me she'd checked my references and everyone said I was someone who showed up and did things right. I signed the contract that afternoon and drove home feeling like I'd finally turned a corner, finally moved from surviving to actually thriving. That night I sat on my back porch with a beer and looked at the house 4 doors down where Reggie had lived. But he didn't live there anymore, had moved out after Simone divorced him, and the house had a for sale sign in the yard that had been there for months. I thought about how his choices had cost him his marriage, his home, his daughter's respect, and while I'd played a part in exposing it all, he'd built the bomb himself. I'd just lit the fuse. Tasha had moved back in with her mother across town, had transferred to a different salon, had essentially vanished from the life we'd built together, and sometimes I wondered if she thought about me, about what she'd thrown away, but mostly I just didn't think about her at all anymore. 1 year after I'd installed those first cameras, I got a call on my business line from someone requesting a security system installation, and I almost didn't take the job because I was busy enough to be selective. But something made me answer, some instinct or maybe just coincidence, and when I said, "Johnson Security, this is Malik," the voice on the other end went quiet for a long second before speaking. It was Tasha, her voice smaller than I remembered, asking if I still did residential security installations, and I felt something twist in my chest that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite satisfaction, just recognition of how far we'd both fallen and risen from where we'd been. She didn't acknowledge who she was at first, just gave me an address and asked about pricing, and I could have called her out, could have said I knew it was her, but something made me play along. I told her my rates, told her I could come by that week for a consultation, and she agreed in a voice that shook slightly around the edges. We set an appointment for Thursday afternoon, and when I hung up, I sat in my truck staring at my phone, trying to decide if this was closure or just reopening wounds that had finally scarred over. I called Auntie Renee and told her what happened, and she was quiet for a long time before saying, "Maybe she needs to see what she lost, baby. Maybe you both need to see who you are now on the other side of all that pain." Thursday came, and I drove to the address she'd given, a small apartment in a complex off Memorial Drive, nothing like the house we'd owned together, and I felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness seeing how far she'd fallen. She answered the door when I knocked, and we looked at each other for the first time in a year, and she'd aged in ways that had nothing to do with time, her eyes harder, her smile gone, her whole presence diminished in a way that should have felt like victory, but just felt hollow. "Hi, Malik," she said quietly, stepping back to let me in, and I nodded and entered with my tool bag. All business, all professional, giving her nothing of anger or forgiveness, just neutrality. I walked through her apartment making notes about window and door placements, about Wi-Fi signal strength, about where cameras would be most effective, and she followed me room to room in silence until finally she spoke. "I know you know it's me," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I know this is weird, asking you for help after everything." I turned to look at her and saw tears in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No urge to comfort or condemn, just a vast emptiness where love and hate had both burned out. "I've been getting calls," she continued. "Someone keeps calling at night and breathing but not talking, and I'm scared, and I didn't know who else would understand about security systems." I believed her about the calls, but I also knew she was lying about not knowing who else to call, that this was about seeing me, about maybe asking forgiveness, or maybe just seeing if I'd survived what she'd done to me. I gave her a quote, fair but not discounted, and I told her I could install everything by the end of next week if she agreed to the price. She nodded and asked if we could talk. Really talk. And I told her there was nothing to say that hadn't been said in the letter I'd left her a year ago. "I'm sorry," she said anyway, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in for months. "I was selfish and cruel, and I threw away something real for something that meant nothing, and I think about it every day, about what I lost, about who I hurt." I listened because I owed her nothing, but I could give her this moment, this confession. But when she finished, I just pulled out my tablet and had her sign the work order, my signature next to hers on a document that was all business, no intimacy, no connection beyond customer and contractor. I came back the following week with my equipment and Deshawn, and we spent 6 hours installing cameras and sensors and door alarms, making her small apartment as secure as the house I'd once shared with her. She stayed out of the way mostly, working on her laptop in the kitchen, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't read and didn't want to interpret. When we finished, I showed her how to use the system, how to check the feeds from her phone, how to set alerts and review footage, and the irony of teaching her the same technology that had exposed her betrayal wasn't lost on either of us. She thanked me when I was packing up to leave, her voice soft and sad, and she said if I ever needed anything, if I ever wanted to talk, she'd be there, and I nodded, but we both knew I'd never call. Deshawn and I walked out to the van, and he asked if that was my ex-wife, said he'd heard stories from other guys on job sites about my divorce, and I told him it was, but it didn't matter anymore, that it was old business, finished and buried. He was quiet for a minute, and then said, "You seem good, though, like you landed on your feet better than she did." And I realized he was right, that somewhere in the process of surviving her betrayal, I'd built something stronger than what I'd lost. I had my own company now, Johnson Security Systems, had 3 employees and a growing client list, had respect in the community and money in the bank, and a future that belonged entirely to me. Tasha had an apartment and a job, and fear that drove her to call the man she'd destroyed, and that asymmetry felt like justice without me having to do anything except live well. Driving away from her apartment, I didn't look back, didn't feel regret or satisfaction or anything except a quiet sense of completion, like a chapter ending the way it was supposed to. I thought about the man I'd been a year ago, the trusting husband who'd installed cameras thinking he was protecting his home from strangers, never imagining the real threat was already inside. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder and wiser and less willing to ignore his instincts when they whispered that something was wrong. I'd survived betrayal and come out the other side not bitter but careful, not broken but rebuilt, and that felt like a victory that mattered more than any revenge I could have engineered. That evening I went to Auntie Renee's for Sunday dinner like I did most weeks, and she asked how the installation had gone, whether seeing Tasha had opened old wounds. I told her the truth, that it had been strange but not painful, that I'd looked at her and felt nothing but a distant recognition of who she used to be to me, like looking at a photograph of someone you used to know. "That's healing, baby," Auntie Renee said, patting my hand across her kitchen table. "That's you being free of what she did, free to build something new without carrying all that weight." I knew she was right, knew that forgiveness wasn't about absolving Tasha but about releasing myself from the prison of anger and hurt, about choosing to move forward instead of staying trapped in the past. The months that followed brought more growth than I could have imagined, my business expanding as word spread about quality work and fair prices, about a company that showed up when it said it would and did things right the first time. I hired 2 more electricians and started bidding on commercial jobs, got a contract with a school district to upgrade their security systems, landed a deal with a real estate developer to wire new construction. Money came in steady and solid, enough to move out of the house that held too many painful memories and into a new place in Brookhaven, a condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city skyline, a space that had never known Tasha or Reggie or any of the betrayal that had defined my old life. I started dating again eventually. Nothing serious at first, just coffee and dinners with women I met through work or friends, learning how to trust again in small increments, in moments that didn't carry the weight of forever. One woman, Angela, a teacher I'd met while installing cameras at her school, made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years, and when I told her about my divorce, she listened without judgment, just held my hand and said, everyone carried scars from love that hadn't worked, that the important thing was not letting those scars stop you from trying again. We took things slow, and I appreciated that. Appreciated her patience with my caution. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I could imagine a future that included someone else without fear drowning out the hope. On the 1-year anniversary of finalizing my divorce, I was sitting in my new living room going through contracts when my phone buzzed with a notification from Facebook, a memory from 2 years ago, a photo of Tasha and me at the neighborhood cookout, both of us smiling, both of us looking happy in a way that had probably already been a lie even then. I looked at that photo for a long time, at the man I'd been who didn't know what was coming, who trusted completely and loved without reservation, and I felt gratitude for him even though his naivety had led to such pain, because without that experience I wouldn't have become who I was now. I deleted the memory, cleared it from my timeline and went back to my contracts, to my present, to the life I'd built from the ashes of what she'd burned down. Later that night, I stood on my balcony looking out at Atlanta's lights spreading across the horizon, and I thought about security, about how I'd built a business around helping people feel safe in their homes, protecting them from threats they couldn't always see or anticipate. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd failed to protect myself, that all my cameras and systems had only shown me the truth after the damage was done. But maybe that was the real lesson, that security wasn't about preventing every bad thing from happening, but about having the evidence and strength to respond when it did. I'd responded not with violence or public destruction, but with quiet strategy, with patience and planning. And I'd won not by destroying Tasha and Reggie, but by building something better than what they'd taken from me. I smiled then, genuinely and freely, and pulled out my phone to text Angela about dinner plans for the weekend, about maybe driving down to Savannah for a few days if she could get someone to cover her classes. She responded immediately with excitement and started planning details, and I felt something warm spread through my chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been peace, or might have been both. The past was done, buried under new experiences and new relationships and new versions of myself that bore the scars but weren't defined by them. And when I went to bed that night, I slept soundly, dreamlessly, free. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Malik's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.